Because it's, the silly season, as they say. It's the time of, holidays, and, politicians go on holiday as well. Um, there's not a lot really of political news to talk about. However, of course, the political journalists, etc., still get paid for this month, and so as a result, they've got to come up with stories, and this is where you tend to see a lot of silly stories or things like that. Hence the moniker of the month, the silly season. And one of the big silly season um, stories, of course, has been what does a reform UK government, or what would one mean for like the UK economy? What would it mean for the UK? And as I've said before, I think it would be very, very bad, incredibly bad, if you look at some of the stuff that Farage has talked about or proposed in the past. Um, but there would be a slight golden lining to all this. As much as I don't want it, as much as I never would want that to happen, the golden lining is that Farage would be in charge, and that has never happened because Farage has never ever taken any responsibility for any of the things or any of the decisions that he has championed or proposed in the past. As Prime Minister, Farage would have nowhere to hide. Winning for him would be the worst thing ever to happen in his career, because the buck stops with him. He has to make decisions. He has to do stuff. You can't sit there and do nothing. At the end of the day, you're in government. All this stuff that you hear Farage complaining about, he's the opposition. He gets to throw stones from the outside. That doesn't work when you are in power. So that would be the only, like I say, silver lining to all that. That Farage would finally, I think, be very, very much exposed. Just as, of course, as we saw with Boris Johnson, finally, be exposed once he was in power. There was nowhere to hide on that. So before we go on more into this, please do, like I say, click on the like, share, and subscribe button down below. Of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there is the YouTube membership down below as well. So let's crack on then into this. This comes from the East Anglia Byline Times of what would a reform UK government actually mean for the UK economy. The left are now currently tying themselves in knots over the emergence of Jeremy Corbyn's new party. Owen Jones even says he will support it. Others, of course, see this vote on the left now as very likely to help make a future reform government more likely. I would, of course, not comment on Jones's view, but the other argument does seem very hard to fault. Although we are still at least 4 years away from an election where anything could happen, reform is, of course, apparently ahead in the polls, and any reduction in the Labour vote must, by definition, make it more easy for them to form the next government rather than less. Two, of course, potential cabinet members would, of course, be Farage in Clacton, obviously, and his deputy Richard Trice in Boston and Skegness. The other, of course, on the patch, or at least not far off it, will, of course, Rupert Lowe in Great Yarmouth mend his fences with Farage and maybe make up a third. I wouldn't bet against it. I wouldn't bet against it either, but, Rupert Lowe now has his own party. What that means, who knows? We'll yet, of course, see. We've yet have to see any have a sit down and actually work out what a reform administration would actually look like, and its implications now for effectiveness of government, the housing market, pensions, the economy as a whole. This all follows now of the necessary speculation because reform's declared intentions are, of course, unformed and very unclear. But at least let's try. So the first move is obviously a fair bet, would be a Doge-style purge of government departments, because this is what reform has now already attempted in local authorities where it was taking control. The argument, of course, we hear is that civil servants are all woke lefties who do little work anyway, so we can live with fewer of them. Given, of course, the current reform MPs have zero experience in national office, this has now every likelihood of misfiring. Civil servants are there for Nigel to allow ministers to implement policy, except, of course, a degree of incompetence across government departments as the first consequences of a reform administration. Attempting now to ship all migrants to either Rwanda, Albania, or Xanadu requires, of course, detailed and difficult negotiations with all those countries. And who do you think carries out all those talks, Nigel? It isn't the ministers. Second, of course, and probably parallel in this development, will be the severe downward pressure on the value of the pound. Investors hate uncertainty, and apparent emergence now of an impotent government will now only likely add to this. Inward investment to the UK, including in particular now of purchase of government debt, will largely decrease. Anyway, the economic consequences are, of course, catastrophic. A collapsing pound would then put pressure on inflation, only partly because important goods would cost more on the interest rates. The Bank of England's job is, of course, to raise the base rate to attempt to counter rising inflation. Except the bank was, of course, made independent back in 1997 to prevent politicians from trying to influence voters by manipulating these rates, such as cutting them to spark an economic boom just ahead of an election. However, Tice has obviously indicated that reform might do just that. And this is dangerous territory. Already spooked by markets, these would now react even worse. And any suggestion the UK economy was then being manipulated for political reasons, which is pretty much what happened, by the way, after the Truss Kwarteng budget, is going to be a disaster. Very, very much so a disaster. So here is, of course, the scenario. Inflation now is running at 15 to 20%. It has been there before in a living memory. And of course, we're heading there after the Truss Kwarteng debacle. Meanwhile, of course, reform now is pulling all the levers at the bank to try and keep rates at, for the sake of argument, a comfortable 3%. Why would the banks lend any money to mortgages, for example? The housing market would, of course, collapse because no one could move house. Soaring inflation devalues the worth of existing housing stock. And of course, the new building would pretty much cease because why put up any homes if no one can buy them? All this is, of course, speculative. The next effect, of course, on pensions is less so. There are, as you know, or will know, two types of pension: final salary or defined benefit. The defined contribution, the final salary pensions are, of course, index linked and they go up with inflation. Except, of course, that a substantial bout of high inflation is probably unaffordable to all those funds administrating them. They will either fail to raise payments, making pensioners poorer in real terms, or even risk going bust. The defined contribution pensions are now more common, someone allowing to take on board a pension pot, a fixed sum of money, and invest it according to pay of their old age. Soaring inflation would then diminish the value of those pension pots, making the pensioners now poorer as well. So that's pensioners sorted as well. And like I say, if this happens, that will be the ultimate death knell for Farage. It is very clear to see that still pensioners command quite a very loud and effective political bloc. Why? Because, believe it or not, pensioners are very motivated to go out and vote. Very, very much so motivated to go out and vote. They are use that time and time again against multiple political parties. And we've seen that recently. We saw that back in 2017. So, how about, of course, the economy then as a whole? Well, while higher inflation would, of course, make exporting goods easier, importing foods and others are now a much dearer. This as well would put pressure on pensioners, which means a cost of living crisis way worse than the one that we've just suffered through. We will all then have to grit our teeth and buy food with now more certainty will now go hungry. UK focused businesses providing non essential goods, though, will of course lose out. Pubs and restaurants will suffer as people will cut back. All those supplying them, along with the retailers selling, for example, clothes and electrical goods. The housing market has then dried up. All those estate agents, solicitors will then get hit. Plus, the retailers supplying the goods to new home buyers. Moving home is significantly trickier and trigger now to consumer spending. The ripples will then flow through then the job market, those affected by firms and layoff of staff. All those will now start to draw benefits, will then go off into the public payroll. All will reform, just say that there are no more benefits. The gravy train has come off the rails, suckers. Find work or starve. Again, wouldn't surprise me if you saw that. They talk a lot about benefits and cutting all that off. So all of this as above is, I said, purely speculation, though upward pressure on inflation, of course, looks a given. But one last consequence, much more likely, and of course now truly more climactic. A quarter of all government debt in the form of gilts is index linked. A huge jump in inflation then puts immense pressure on public finances because of interest rates on the debt then soars. It is then presumably unaffordable, so a reform government may be forced to renege on the promise to raise the rates paid for existing lenders to match the inflation rates. The consequence then, no one will buy government debt for the appreciable future. All governments, again, from Reform to the future Prime Minister Corbyn, are then reliant on gilt insurance to keep the country functioning. Except, of course, that there will be not much of a country left to function. What if I suggest does come about? I would add further downsides, such as drying up overseas investment in the UK, a lower tax income, and further job losses. But that is all enough horror for now. All speculative, as I said, and I said no one, of course, very few times when I fervently hope them now talking complete and utter rubbish. And generally, I hope so too. But like I say, it is the silly season. Um, this you tend to see a lot of articles around this, and we've all seen them. But that is the reality of what a reform government could do if they move badly and inflation goes a lot of bad knock-on effects. Reason why we're like Rachel Reeves is having such a problem is because of that. Again, that inflation, again, all linked to those gilts index. Otherwise, you have to pay more money. The government has to give more money to pay off that, for those gilts. So inflation does matter quite a bit, but we'll see what happens. And like I say, hopefully something that will never come to pass. But if it does, well, Farage in charge. It's all on him then, just as you've seen with all these, reform councils. It's all on them. If they fail and go belly up, well, it's all on them. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time. And of course, don't forget to hit the like and share button on your way out. And we'll see you all very soon.